Ken Burns, isn't it just time to admit it was all a big mistake? You should just have paid your taxes and stuck with the mother country.
Yeah, I guess it still hurts, doesn't it?
Let's speak to the man himself, Ken Burns. Ken Burns, this series has been, as I understand it, in the works for nearly a decade. There's a lot of hard work going into it. During that time, how did your understanding of the revolution evolve? And were there any major surprises or myths that you had to dismantle?
I think it was a constant surprise. You know, we've spent the entire time working on it. We don't make films about things we want to tell you what you should study. We are interested in sharing with you the process of our discovery, and every day was a spectacular new fact that we learned, that we came to understand. I think for Americans, the revolution is drowning in sentimental treacle. The barnacles of sentimentality and nostalgia have encrusted it. And we don't see it as anything but guys thinking great ideas in Philadelphia. They are really good ideas, both in 1776 and then later at our Constitutional Convention in 1787. We don't sort of acknowledge the violence of this bloody revolution and a civil war. It's not like it's just them, the British overseas, and we're throwing them off. But there is a large section of the population that is loyalist. There are Native Americans and enslaved and free blacks who side with the British. There is, of course, the global dimensions to this revolution and civil war with the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch coming in on the side of the Americans. So it's a very complex, fluid dynamic that we're constantly sort of having to bump up against that nostalgia and that treacle in the course of understanding it. And it's actually thrilling and exhilarating as you shed the sort of the tropes that have attended any grammar school education, but then also the way in which we sort of think about it popularly. And I think particularly at this moment in America's history, to go back to the founding moment and to figure out what it was actually about, what actually happened, what were those sequence of battles. In fact, the signing of the Declaration, the war has been going on for a year and a quarter. The first rebellion is taking place in Lexington in April of 1775. So by the time they've decided that, yes, we want independence from Parliament, independence from George III, there's already been a significant number of battles, one of which at Bunker Hill has had enormous casualties. It's a Pyrrhic victory for the British. They have 40% casualties, which they're not going to see again, the British historian Stephen Conway says in our film, until the first day of the Somme in 1916. So all of a sudden, the kind of superficial version of this bloodless, gallant myth gets destroyed.
I mean, one of the things the documentary, among many things the series brings out, is the complexity. And you're quite right. The revolution is often painted in simple colours, often painted as a war of independence. But you make it clear it was also a war of conquest, a civil war, mainly between British loyalists and patriots, and a world war too.
Yes.
Has all of that, as well as the war of independence element, has all of that shaped the U.S. just as much as the War of Independence?
Yes, very, very, very much so. And I think, though, that we are not totally unwilling, but we tend to be unwilling to sort of dive deep, to scratch the surface of the convenient mythological ideas of, as I said, great men in Philadelphia thinking great thoughts. They're there, and they're really important stuff. This argument between British citizens gets broken out into an Enlightenment argument about the natural rights of people, and the first time a revolution is held, suggesting that there are certain unalienable rights that all people have, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. However imperfectly they were applied to the American Revolution into the subsequent decades of the first century of this republic, they're nonetheless revolutionary and caused a spasm for more than 200 years, first in Europe and then in the Caribbean and South America and later Asia and Africa, that still reverberates. So Ho Chi Minh declared independence from Vietnamese independence from the French and the Japanese, as the Japanese were surrendering, and he quotes Thomas Jefferson, and there are two OSS officers standing next to him. I mean, that's the last war we did on Vietnam, but you can begin to see the kind of rippling complexity of this. And yet we also don't understand the bottom up story, who's involved. And so off camera, read by the finest actors in the world, is a cast of 150 separate voices, 400 quotes, read by 61 actors that bring to life the stories. And as we say in the opening, it's not just a struggle between Englishmen over Indian land, taxes, and representation, but a bloody civil war that will engage more than 24 nations, European as well as Native Americans, that somehow still came to be about some of the noblest aspirations of humankind. So if you can hold the contradictions inherent in that sort of opening salvo sentence, then you can begin to appreciate what an enormously interesting story the American Revolution is, not just for Americans to get it right and to understand more accurately where they came from, but for the world to understand.
Yes.
Because
no, it's a global story.
It is
a global story.
Exactly.
Now in that story, you delve into the role of, I think, what you might call those whose role has been overlooked by previous historians, perhaps going back a little bit. I'm talking about the enslaved and the free black people of North America at the time.
Yeah.
The native nations, and of course the loyalists, they were the losers. So in all history, it's the winners that write the history. But you bring some new insights into that this wasn't just a battle of sort of white patriots on one side, white loyalists on the other side. There were a lot more than that involved.
That's correct. And let's just take the population. It's at least 20% of the 2.5 to 3 million present at the beginning of the American Revolution, free and enslaved black people. 20,000, we believe, fought during the war, 15,000 for the British, who often, quite cynically, because the British Empire's great wealth was built in large measure on the profits derived from the 13 other colonies in the Caribbean, which were much more profitable than the mainland stuff. But often the choice an African American might make would be to join the side of the British, and to do that, 5,000 fought for the Patriots. And the same is true with Native Americans, who are beginning to make very complex decisions that are going to destroy ancient alliances between them, as the Western tribes would side with the British, the Eastern tribes, who were more familiar and assimilated, would side with the Americans, and old alliances would be destroyed. It's very, very complex, and we tend to also ignore half the population, the women who are central to the story. This is nothing new. This scholarship has been around for more than 50 years, since the celebration of the bicentennial. But what happens is it hasn't yet trickled down into sort of the common awareness. So we're thrilled, and the success of the series in the United States is just staggering. The first time PBS has had a program in the top 10 of streamers, it's now, that was at 565 million minutes of viewing. It's now well over 4 billion. So
I'm
Americans
not surprised.
really
I watched it. I watched it in America, and my friends are talking about it. I got two more questions for you. We've not got much time. You make it clear in the documentary series that Washington and Jefferson, people of almost mythical status in U.S. history, were major slave owners, as were many other founding fathers. And when you look at the issue of slavery, was it simply the case that the 13 colonies, they could not leave together to set up this new country without the non-slave states accepting slavery had to go with it?
I think that one of the great temporizing moments of the revolution is the willingness to kick the can at the time, particularly of the Constitutional Convention, and not deal with slavery. Benjamin Franklin had introduced a resolution, but the Congress, the Constitution had already enshrined that for the purposes of apportionment and representation, that black people would have no votes and no rights, but they would be counted as 3/5 of a person in those states where they were dominant. And of course, that gave the South an unusual political power, control over not only the White House but the Congress until the Civil War. So it's a very interesting dynamic. I don't know if that's true. I mean, one of the great things is that nobody was talking about slavery. The historian Bernard Bailyn says in the film before the Revolution, there were a few who made points about how evil it was. He said, once you've said all men are created equal, it's done. Slavery's over. And it's just surprising how long it takes to disappear in the United States.
It took another civil war, if I can put it that way.
Exactly.
Just in the final minute or so, it's time to fess up, Ken, now. Time to be honest with us. When you look at the state of America today, Ken Burns, isn't it just time to admit it was all a big mistake? You should just have paid your taxes and stuck with the mother country.
Yeah, I guess it still hurts, doesn't it? You know, we showed only a small portion when we were recently at the British Library of the Battle of Yorktown because I didn't want to upset folks too much. We particularly at this 250 where we find ourselves at such a critical juncture, a kind of existential threats to the sort of the main stuff, the ingredients, the recipe of this thing. We are, I think, looking back as any individual does in crisis, back to their origin story to say, where do we come from? And I think it's important that Americans have always made King George the enemy and the bad guy and an idiot and a madman, and he's not. He is an incredible, as the British Library shows, that his book collection is literally the center of that magnificent building.
Bigger than Donald Trump's.
King
Ken, I'm going to have to interrupt you. We're going to have to leave it there. But I'd like to congratulate you on this documentary series. It's simply wonderful in its scope and its depth and its seriousness of purpose. And people can see it in the United Kingdom. It will premiere in June on BBC iPlayer. Ken Burns, America's, maybe the world's, premier documentary maker.